So I don't see that, for example, key feature. If you see the, for example, Indian democratic system, even though we call it as a democracy, that's what I was saying, right? So as citizens, we really don't have much stake in decisions that are being made, right? A lot of things are today, for example, in a small town in like Melkote in Karnataka, a lot of the decisions are actually made in cities like Bangalore and Delhi. Right? Even though we call it as a panchayat raj system, even it doesn't have any financial autonomy. Right? A lot of things often through gram sabhas, we can give a plan of it, we can chalk out it, but everything is finally decided on the top layers. Right? That's a major difference. And all the decisions that you see is actually based on majoritarian rule. So that's why the political system that is being advocated through idea of Swaraj is something quite radical than whatever the system that we have today, right? It actually, even though it says in words, it should be take consensus and all that, but in reality, it's not decentralized as much as needed, as well as decisions are not being made often based on consensus. Yeah. And even though all these kinds of different forms that we're talking about is, again, it's not in the hands of ordinary people. I really don't have control over the gasoline, or I don't have control over lithium, right? So that's what I'm saying. So we should since if you really are interested in creating a much more democratic society, so resources should be accessible to everybody, right? So one such important source is human energy. That's what I'm saying. Yeah. So that's why here in the idea of Swaraj, the idea of development. So once you fulfill your basic material needs like food, clothing, and shelter, it shifts to more towards spiritual or moral dimension, right? So achieving this sort of mental state, achieving peace is the ultimate goal, but that is completely contrary to the modern sustainable development, for example, right? It only talks about economic growth. Economic growth is nothing but accumulating more and more material wealth and power, right? But at the same time, it says that we should establish a world of equality and sustainability, but there is a contradiction in it, right? So if your conception of good life is accumulation of more and more material wealth and power, it won't lead to a much more equitable and sustainable future, right? If you're emphasizing on that, you have to lead a much more simpler life. So that is the connection that we have, and we should be very clear of that. Yeah.
Namaste and welcome to another Indic Talks episode. Today we have our speaker Sumanas Koulagi Ji, who will be talking about Swaraj, or the idea of the development as Swaraj towards a non-violent society. Environmental crisis and inequality are pushing human civilization to the verge of extinction. At this context, the talk discusses Swaraj development paradigm as a potential pathway for humanity to overcome these deep problems and attain long-lasting peace. I welcome Sumanas Ji to talk about this same topic. Welcome, sir, and I open the floor to you.
Thank you. Thank you very much. Thank you. It's a pleasure to be here and to share my thoughts with all of you. And today in my talk, basically, it'll have two parts in it. The first part is more of a theoretical ideas, discussing around the idea of Swaraj in the broader context of development. And the other part, the second part, is more of a practice, what we've been trying to do in our own place in a very small way to bring this whole idea of Swaraj into practice. And yeah, so let me directly start my presentation. And yeah, the first question is, I think I've always been interested is the concept of development itself, right? Because today you go and talk to anybody, even in a remote rural village or in urban centers, everybody aspires for development, and everybody wants this development, get developed. And but often we don't ask, what does it mean? What does it mean by getting developed? And broadly speaking, as an ordinary conception, or if you're going to talk to masses, the one thing that you understand is their idea of development is seen in terms of accumulating more and more material wealth and power. If you're doing that, then you're in the process of progress. And this is not just only limited to individuals, but even in the larger scale of nation states, right? They also have kind of a similar kind of vision, and they're kind of through various channels, they're reinforcing this idea within the society. And but essentially, if you really start understanding the layer by layer, you realize that development is kind of an essentially an intentional act originating from enduring human tendency to achieve a perceived notion of good life, right? There is a good life idea is embedded in it, and we have always been trying to achieve that through various means. So that whole process is nothing but development. And it has become a global faith and a central organizing principle today. And so this is what I was discussing earlier, right? So this is the conception of, these are the pictures that depicts our mainstream idea of development that we have today. Having big buildings, cars. If you have a two-wheeler, tomorrow you need four-wheeler. If you have a small house, you need a big house. And urbanization, huge roads, infrastructures. It's very material centered and power centered. And this sort of idea of development is causing this broader problem. One is of environment, and there are a lot of evidences that showing, we only have another 30 years. Otherwise, we lose out fundamentals of life like air, water, and soil, and it becomes becoming more and more difficult to sustain ourselves on this planet, right? So this is a huge challenge that everybody is facing today. So it involves climate change, biodiversity loss, resource scarcity, all these kinds of stuff. And the other is inequality. All different kinds of inequality, particularly of wealth. If you see year and year, rich is getting richer and poor is getting poorer. And very recent reports from Oxfam, it says that almost 75% of the wealth that was generated very recently in recent years is in the hands of less than 10% and top 1%. So this shows that how the whole society is getting divided into different, it's creating more kind of a tension within the society. And so how to reduce this inequality, and also at the same time resolving this whole problem of environment in the longer run is a big question. And the core reason for, as I could say it, the core reason for these two problems lies in our conception of development. So this sort of material centered, power centered idea of development that we have embarked upon. So this is causing this larger two problems. So so this is where, in this whole larger context of environment problem and the inequality that we are facing, so the development is at the heart, right? That is causing these two big problems. And so that's why we need a kind of an alternate vision of development. And so I particularly find Mahatma Gandhi and his associate economic thinker, J.C. Kumarappa. So he was a trained economist from Colombia who worked with Gandhi for almost 2 to 3 decades. And in their thoughts, actually, we could find a lot of interesting ideas that could actually helps to solve this larger problem that we are in. So this is what I was telling you earlier. And so let me just, one of the, even though they have spoken on various things, especially Gandhi and Kumarappa, the central strand that, cut across all through their actions and their ideas is the notion of Swaraj. Swaraj meant for Gandhi, it was self-rule, ruling ourselves. And the whole central quest that Gandhi and Kumarappa were actually dealing with was to how we can create a non-violent society or exploitation-free society where individuals can have more control over their life, right? So how to do that was a central quest that Gandhi and Kumarappa was dealing with. And this is exactly what their conception of Swaraj actually encompasses. And so let me just now get much more deeper into their understanding of Swaraj and how we could see it in the broader context of development. And for Gandhi and Kumarappa, basically, the living condition of humans is actually shaped by three interconnected forces. And it was called as moral political economy, right? There is a moral force and the political force and the economic forces. And for morality, it is kind of a sense of right and wrong. and politics is nothing but power relations and larger human relations in a way, and economy is material relations. So these are the three important forces that actually operates on everyday basis and actually shapes our living condition. So that's why for Gandhi and Kumarappa, so how to what kind of relationships that we have with all these three kinds of forces was very central in their understanding of Swaraj. And so let me just now compare their idea of Swaraj in the development context and our prevailing development model. So if you just compare, this is the slide that shows you that. So one is the fundamental understanding is actually the cosmology, right? So how as individuals we um, uh, connect ourselves with the larger world. That relationships becomes very central. And in the prevailing development model, that is built on this basic understanding or the basic notion that individuals are completely autonomous and completely detached from the rest of the cosmos. You don't need to care about anybody else, and you have complete free will, and whatever you want, you could do it. It's basically that kind of pre-assumption that prevailing development model has. But in the idea of Swaraj, it is completely built on completely a different cosmology altogether. And it was, Gandhi used to call it as truth. The whole idea of Swaraj is built on this basic conception of truth. And for truth, for Gandhi, it was that interconnectedness of life, which is something everlasting. If you just trace back, for example, our own lives, for example, food, which is something very essential for our existence. If you just trace back, how it has become possible, the food that we have every day, there are so many people have worked behind the scene, right? Irrespective of different gender, caste, religion, even non-human beings, they've all been sort of contributing to it. So that is finally leading to the food that we're consuming and that we're sustaining ourselves. So this basic material connections actually makes you understand this, how everything is interconnected and we're not completely independent of each other, right? So all the contributions made by all other beings in the world, that is actually resulting in my own existence. So that's why here in terms of morality, individual good is embedded in the good of all, right? That becomes primary objective in the Swaraj development model. But it is completely contrary to the prevailing development model, which actually, for it, good is something, good life is something maximizing on pleasure through continuous power and material accumulation, right? But here in Swaraj, you'll be thinking about the larger good, not just only about self or bodily self, right? And so that this is the major difference in terms of morality, right? And here in the idea of Swaraj, good life is something is seen as attainment of peace, so that is seen as an ultimate goal, or what we used to call it as moksha, right? So it is nothing but it has two dimensions to it. One is internal mind of tranquility, the other one is external harmonious relationship with other beings in the cosmos, right? These are the two sides of the same coin. And so this is the major difference in the idea of good life, because in the idea of Swaraj, is good life is is seen as in terms of peace, but here it is more in terms of accumulation of material and power in the prevailing development model. And here the morality is dependent on based on understanding that individual good is embedded in the good of all in the idea of Swaraj. And in the prevailing development model, it has nothing to do with others. Basically, individual good is completely in your control, right? You have to do whatever you like. So this is the broadly the difference in terms of morality and the idea of good life embedded in both the idea of development that I'm talking about. And if you come to the politics, the human relationships in a society, the prevailing development vision, it actually talks about centralization of power or human relationships, right? And it's basically even though it talks about democracy, right, but it is actually based on domination. It's based on majoritarian rule, right? And this itself is problematic at various levels, right? So for example, today, even though we talk about as a modern nation state, so we talk about democracy and panchayat raj, but in reality, it's not, power is actually is highly centered in Delhi and other places, right? And for example, as a citizen of Melkote, the small town in southern Karnataka, I really don't have much power to decide, what I want, how I should see my town, right? There is very little space for us to, engage in the decisions that impacts our own lives, right? So this is a major difference, right? It talks about centralization of power, and also violence is seen as, is accepted means to bring any change in the power relations. But here, in the idea of Swaraj, here the power relations is more decentralized, right? For them, decentralizing power and giving more and more control over, for people, giving control over their lives was just so essential, right? And so that's why here, even though they talk about in the idea of Swaraj a democracy, it is seen as in terms of more of a non-violent democracy, which is based on consensus, right? So consensus becomes essential character because this is the only way where you could assure equal voice for everybody, irrespective of their background. It could be of different caste, gender, religion. Again, so everybody gets an equal voice in decision-making process. So through that, they get more control over their life. That's why here in the idea of Swaraj development paradigm, the politics is actually based on consensus and decentralization of power, right? And also this is where the whole satyagraha comes in, right? Because Gandhi and Kumarappa in the idea of Swaraj, they clearly recognize, so human beings, we have two sides to it, right? So human nature, it has a two sides. So one is of self-interest, the other one is of altruism, right? And since we have self-interest, so it's always seen as that, there are possibilities, even though if you could establish this sort of a decentralized political system, there could be a lot of, exploitation could creep in, because as human beings, as human nature, we have self-interest side to us, right? So that's why, this is where, very interestingly, Gandhi evolves the strategy of satyagraha. Satyagraha is essentially an act of, basically love. Through that force, you will be basically changing equations, changing exploitative relationship into a harmonious one, right? Through the power of love. And so this is something, very interesting and very important in the whole idea of Swaraj development, and especially in its political structure. And the last, component in this whole development paradigm is the economy, right? And economy is essentially a kind of, how as human beings we, fulfill our basic material needs. That itself is, seen as economy. And so here, the modern development paradigm, the economy is actually uh, based on the conception of efficiency, right? Here you have to produce more and consume more. That becomes the main agenda. But here, in the idea of Swaraj development paradigm, the economy is based on efficiency, but instead it is based on self-sufficiency, right? Here, reducing the distance between producer and consumer becomes more and more important. And economy is something very central in the Swaraj development paradigm, because they clearly recognize, Gandhi and Kumarappa, that if we are, devoid of, if we don't, fulfill our basic material needs, basically, that is the source of our self-interest, right? If you're hunger, you really cannot think about the larger good at all. And that's why, the central question economy in Swaraj development paradigm is to, it's a it's basically how to make sure that everybody, fulfills this basic material needs like food, clothing, and shelter. So how to do that? It's a very central in the Swaraj development paradigm. And I was telling earlier, so here the whole economy is built on this notion of self-sufficiency. And self-sufficiency doesn't mean that you have to produce whatever you want in everything. It's not like that. But instead, it's more about reducing the distance between production and consumption. And that is something very important in the Swaraj development paradigm, because they recognize, the whole development is a both moral and material project, right? It has a two sides to it. For example, today as consumers, we purchase in the market. If you have, if you can afford it, or if you just like it, we just go and purchase it. But we really don't consider, how this material, products are being produced, right? So for example, textile, right? So if you see all the huge big brands like Zara to other big brands that we see, it's all produced out of so much of exploitation. If you just trace back, right? So for example, a lot of these garments, the brands are actually, their garments are being produced in places like Dhaka, right? And if you just go and see the whole living condition in those spaces, just are so horrible. People who work there, they don't even get living wages, and they don't have harsh working conditions. They don't have any freedom. There is so much of work pressure. If they have to want to use the loo, basically they have to finish off their targets first. So in such kind of a harsh and regimented condition, our so-called branded garments are being produced today, right? As consumers sitting somewhere in Bangalore or in Mumbai, in purchasing such products which are produced out of so much of exploitation, so we will be becoming part in that exploitation, and that's been happening, right? So we'll also be becoming important contributors to in the whole sustaining this whole system of exploitation in other places. So that's why here they clearly recognize that it's only through uh, purchasing which is produced locally, or consuming which is produced locally, you can actually lead a much more ethical life, because that's the only way you could actually trace back how these things are being produced, right? And this is completely contrary to the modern economics, right? It's basically based on efficiency, and it talks about exporting everything, right? Increasing the distance between production and consumption. So that becomes more and more important. And lastly, in the prevailing development model, the whole economy, the primary energy source is actually non-human energy, or oil or other things, non-human here. But in the idea of Swaraj, it is actually uh, because it really recognizes relationship between what kind of an energy source that we use to run our economic systems to the larger social relations. And for example, today everything is driven by oil, right? And whoever controls oil resources will be controlling everybody's lives, right? And as an alternate, today we are thinking of green energies like solar energy, wind energy, and other things. But in reality, they are not actually green if you really consider the whole life cycle of it, right? So instead of mining oil, you'd be mining silica for your solar panels at the end of the day. So that's why the only energy source that is most eco-friendly and has access to everybody is physical labor, right? So human energy. So that's why in the whole scheme of things of Swaraj, the human labor, or human energy becomes a primary energy source that drives the whole economy, right? So actually, any economic system which is based on more and more human labor could actually create a much more democratic politics, right? So that's why this is the major differences, right? In the prevailing development model, it's basically to idea is to move away from physical labor, but here in the idea of Swaraj, it is actually to embracing physical labor. So this is the major difference in terms of economy. So this is the broadly difference that I just wanted to bring out. So between the prevailing development model and the Swaraj development vision. And so now let me just get into the practice of it. These are all theoretical frameworks, but to what extent we could just practice it in our everyday life. So that's a important question. So that's why. So this is where I just wanted to talk about two activities that we are doing through our own organization called Janapada Seva Trust, which was started in 1960. It's almost 65 years now, right? So two things is, one is the Khadi activity, Khadi production, hand spun and hand woven textile production that we do here in Melkote. So we've been trying to run this whole enterprise based on the idea of Swaraj development paradigm, right? And this is what I just wanted to share today. So one is Khadi has a very close connection with the idea of Swaraj, especially during the freedom movement, right? Gandhi actually had seen Khadi as one of the important ways to attain this kind of Swaraj, but unfortunately, a lot of at that point, a lot of time, a lot of people actually felt that Swaraj meant getting freedom from the British, right? But it was just a very limited sense. But Gandhi was always seen as a much larger sense of the idea of Swaraj, which is to create this sort of a non-violent society. And he saw Khadi as one of the important ways to attain such a social order. And so here in post-independent India, unfortunately, what happened was in the Khadi sector, so it actually lost its connection with the spirit of Swaraj that Gandhi always, it was driving the whole Khadi movement as a part of the larger freedom struggle during the, in uh, early 20th century. And but in post-independent India, what happened was the Khadi just became a fabric, it lost its larger idea of, or spirit of Swaraj. And it was just started seeing as just as a way to give employment to the rural poor, right? But it lost its larger idea of creating a non-violent community around this activity. So that's why, very, very consciously from last 3-4 years, we've been trying to infuse this whole idea of Swaraj back to the making of Khadi, right? So to create this sort of a non-violent community around this activity. And so in that front, we have we have done several interventions. So the first thing that we did was with the ownership model, right? So today, if you go and see a lot of this whole kind of an enterprises or collectives, there will be like hierarchies, right? There will be some ownership will be with a few, and all of the people coming and working as wage laborers. So this hierarchy needs to be dismantled because you need to create a much more equal footing. So that's why here what we did was we managed to evolve a kind of a three stakeholder model. So where one third of the investment is actually made by the workers themselves, right? And another one third by Janapati Seva Trust, the organization, and the another one third by coordinator who actually has some vision and can lead the activity. So basically, I decided to take up that role just after finishing my PhD. And We all came together and we decided to invest, made an equal investment. And the idea was whatever the profit and loss is should be equally shared among the three stakeholders, right? So by evolving this kind of an ownership model, so we managed to create a much more equal space, right? Here now everybody is a worker and everybody is a owner, right? So this was something a very important step that we took in the lines of bringing this whole idea of Swaraj into practice. And the second part was especially with the financial part, right? Often, if you go and see all these kinds of collectives or enterprises, often the financial part always, been kept away from actual workers, right? Because often they don't have any stake in it. So, but in our case, since everybody has a stake in it, everybody has a ownership. So we brought in a lot of financial transparency, right? So we come up with our own passbooks that everybody will have a passbook, and in our monthly meeting we all sit together and we discuss as an enterprise how much money we have spent and how much returns we have got, so that everybody knows the financial position of the enterprise, right? This kind of a transparency has brought in a lot of trust within the collective, even though the whole collective is of a small about a dozen people, mostly women. And but it's working in this whole spirit of Swaraj. And all the decisions that are actually that we take with respect to the enterprise is actually based on consensus, not based on majoritarian rule. It's not like I'll be saying something, everybody else will be following it, but instead everybody will actively participate in it, and then we reach a consensus and we take decisions, right? So that's happening. And the other is the whole enterprise now is more actually human centered, not material centered like the modern or other forms of enterprises, right? For example, here whatever the fabric that we make is actually the byproduct of this larger social relations that we're talking about. Here the primary focus is actually on people and their freedom and their self-rule, right? So that is our primary objective, and the production of khadi is just a byproduct of it. And this is completely contrary to the modern economic systems, where the focus will be actually on material that we make, and whoever produces it becomes a secondary, right? And so that's why, since your focus is actually on people and creating a system where people can have more control over their life through the process of consensus, so it sets an inherent limit on the scale, right? So because often we don't take scale as an important parameter, right? Often we think that the modern economics especially is built on this idea of economies of scale. You have to keep on growing to sustain yourselves. But here we feel that it's important to have a limit, maximum limit on the scale, saying that we should not grow beyond a certain number. And we feel that that is just so important because there are a lot of evidences that shows if any collective that goes beyond the number of 30 and 50, so that's where you need hierarchies to manage, right? Reaching consensus becomes more and more difficult. So that's why here, in our scheme of things, we have very consciously made sure that the idea of growth should be more horizontal, right? Not like vertical. Now, once you reach this size of 30 to 50, similar kinds of enterprises or collectives should pop up at different places rather than expanding your own entity. Right? This is completely contrary to the modern economic systems. And and similarly, we felt that it's important to have a limit on production itself, right? Because we are all in this vicious cycle have to produce more and earn more, right? It's a never ending process. So if you're in this race, you lose out so many essentials of life. So that's why here, so what we have done is that we have consciously made sure that we should not work more than certain hours in certain amount. So once you reach that, you should be able to engage yourself in other activities, right? We feel that it is just so essential. And so this has actually brought in a lot of interest in other activities. For example, um, uh, out of the profit that we make, so we have created a lot of other social security funds, and one such fund is called community development fund. Through that, we actually use that money for various activities like theater activities, exposure visits, potlucks, readings, so all these kinds of watching documentaries, all these various things are connected along with the work. And we feel that this angle is just so important, because the whole idea of Swaraj, as I was telling you earlier, it is a both moral and material project, right? You need to work with the morals of people as well as working with their material conditions. And so basically we use all these various activities to make people realize this larger truth of interconnectedness and how individual good is embedded in the good of all, right? So that's we have been constantly doing it. And apart from that, we have created other social security funds, like health fund we have created for health emergencies. We have created a retired fund for, say, if somebody wants to move out of the collective after working so many years, they get some lump sum amount. And also we have created another fund called God's Aid, right? So God's Aid is something, it evolved, like 3 years back. The idea was because the women who work with us, mostly they require small amount of money, for small financial emergencies, like to have petrol for their scooters, or for chappals, or for taking books, for small things. So what we thought was, why these women should always go and ask somebody. Instead of that, we'll keep 1% of the profit in a box, and we called it as a God Shade. The idea was basically nobody will be monitoring it, the whole the money that we have kept. It's basically voluntarily, everybody will have access to it, and whenever somebody wants, they can directly go and take the money from that box, and there'll be a small book we have kept where they have to voluntarily write down how much they have taken, right? And in a month's time, they have to return it back if possible with some interest. So initially, when we started off this, with small amount of 2,000 rupees, then there are a lot of hesitation that you can't just keep money like that. Somebody has to be there, sitting there to monitor, who is taking how much. But interestingly, after 1 year, without monitoring it, the 2,000 rupees had gone up to 2,200 or 300, right? So that actually brought in a lot of trust within the collective, and it shows that how human beings, if you create a right kind of an atmosphere, people can actually operate on their altruistic side. That is possible. So that working beautifully. And also we have made sure that everybody earns living wage, right? If somebody works for 6 hours a day, so they should get living wage. That we have made sure that everybody earns it. And also we have to reduce the income gap within the collective. What we have done is that we have set a cap, right? Saying it as a 3:1, right? If highest is earning 3 rupees, lowest would be earning 1 rupee. And if the highest wants 6 rupees, and he has to make sure that lowest would get 2 rupees. So that kind of cap is just, so we feel that very important, because otherwise, if you see the modern corporations, for example, right, CEOs will be earning lakhs and crores of rupees, but on the other hand, for example, a sweeper in the same corporation will be hardly getting few thousand rupees, right? So there's so much of difference, income inequality. So this is what we have consciously tried to do it. And since the whole Khadi activity is based on physical labor, it is centered around physical labor, it's the most eco-friendly ecosystem, right? So and also through these various interventions that we have made, so we managed to create a system where people can have more control over their life. So this is nothing but a kind of what Gandhi used to call it as a miniature Swaraj. It's kind of an example to inspire people. They could see how it can be operated on real terms, right? And this is what we managed to do. And this is what some of the pictures. For example, this top left corner was the one just before the COVID they had performed a play. It's of that. The top right corner is actually for our own e-commerce website. We wanted to uh, carry out a kind of a photo shoot. So for that, what we did was we asked our viewers themselves to wear what they had produced, right? And we took pictures, and it was a very good experience, right? And so the picture is of that. And bottom left corner is the picture of an exposure visit that we had very recently had gone to North Karnataka to see actual traditional weavers, right? And their situation was just so horrible that 2-3 people in a family will be working together on a loom, but hardly earning about 6 to 8 thousand rupees a month, right? So it actually gives people to go out of their limited kind of space and to realize how people are living differently and their what are their happiness and sorrows, that we feel that that's so important. And it's of that. And the bottom right corner picture is basically it's one of our friend who is a designer. He's actually teaching design to actual our weavers, right? So here our weavers are themselves are the designers. It's not like somebody is there to do just only this kind of a creative intellectual work and other people just have to do the menial physical labor. That is not the case here. We really want to bridge this gap between physical labor and intellectual labor. And and here through these kind of workshops of design workshops where we are actually encouraging our weavers who actually do the weaving to come up with their own designs. They'll be thinking as well as the working, this kind of bridging this thing together and giving equal emphasis on both physical labor and intellectual labor, right? So this is completely contrary to our modern way of living, where the idea is intellectual labor is seen as superior to the physical labor, right? So that is actually being taught through various channels, including our modern schooling, right? So schooling basically always teaches its students to basically seeing it makes students to see physical labor as very undignified thing to do, right? That's why everybody just aspires for working on computers instead of doing farming or weaving or something, these kinds of activities, right? So that's why this is a important way we are trying to bridge this gap between theory, intellectual labor and physical labor. And the similar other initiative we have recently started is a kind of more of an education program. It's called Jeevana Shaale. It's a life school. It's a 4 years program for 10 students of the age group of between uh, 14 and 18 who are actually walkouts of the modern schooling because they don't like to pursue the modern schooling, but they would like to stay back in their own villages and basically carve out their life. And so we have actually selected such students, and it's a 4 years program where we will be teaching them. It's a completely an alternate to our modern schooling. The key features, one would be the whole purpose of this whole program is to basically inspire them to and encourage them to and also get the capacity to basically self-rule, what this Swaraj means, and to lead a life based on that kind of a spirit. So that is the major objective of the whole Jeevana Shaale. And also here it is based on the idea of knowledge democracy, right? And today here the modern schooling, the modern society, so we think that there is a knowledge politics. Often we don't recognize that, right? So we think that whatever we learn in schools and colleges is seen as only the valid knowledge, right? All other forms of knowledges that are embedded in so-called ordinary people are not at all taken into account. So that's why if you see today, especially in huge a part of rural India, there is a kind of people have lost self-respect because they think that basically they don't know anything unless you don't have a degree certificate, right? That's a very sad part of it, even though they know so many things. For example, activity like farming, right? It has so much of knowledge in it. For every act, it has so much of knowledge embedded in it. But as a society, we don't recognize that, right? So this is a big problem. So that's why just only seeing whatever we learn through schools and colleges as a valid knowledge system, the whole idea of education itself is creating kind of a structural inequality, right? So that's why here our idea is to place this whole Jeevana Shaale based on this kind of a knowledge democracy, basically recognizing different forms of knowledges that are embedded in ordinary people as a valid knowledge, right? So that's very important. And also it's we are very consciously understanding how there is a dialectical relationship between material production, knowledge production. Often we think that knowledge is only produced only sitting and reading the books and writing papers, right? But we don't really recognize the other side of it, where an actual kind of material production that we make, it also has so much of knowledge in it, as I was discussing earlier, right? And also here the central to the whole program is again human energy based livelihoods. That is the medium of teaching, right? As I told you, why human energy is just so important, especially in the context of environment and inequality. So that's why here all the livelihoods that we're talking about, that we're teaching the students, is actually human centered. For example, farming, weaving, natural dyeing and block printing, and bull driven oil ghanas, all these kinds of stuff. These are all again human labor centered. We feel that that should be the center, and basically their livelihood, basically they'll be carved out around these activities. And at the same time we'll be teaching other things. For example, one is through these activities they'll be earning their livelihoods and their pocket money through this 4 years program. And at the same time we are teaching them basic language like Kannada and English and bit of mathematics, which is just so essential to understand what's happening around. And also we have a module called human history, where we are talking, taking them through from evolution to where we are heading to. We feel that this larger perspective is just so important if you have to appreciate activities like Khadi or farming today, right? Components are there as a part of the Jeevana Shaale. We have theater, exposure visits, Padayatra. Padayatra, every year, a week-long Padayatra we do in different parts of Karnataka. One we recently finished in northern Karnataka, where today the problem is the speed of life, right? So the speed of life don't actually let you recognize or understand the details, right? And walking is one such way where you slow down your pace of life, and through that you start seeing what's happening around, all the smaller minor details. And we feel that Padayatra is one of the important ways we could actually do that. And so Padayatra is a part of this: volunteering, documentary screening, group counseling, research projects. All these are part of Jeevana Shaale. And so this is the basically the another initiative through which we are trying to bring this whole idea of Swaraj into practice. And these are some of the various activities. Every day they have a spinning sessions. For 1 hour they do spinning on box charkas. We had taken to different places and teaching. This was just some of the pictures I just wanted to show all of you, right? And so this is like through this two activities we are trying to bring this whole idea of Swaraj into practice. And we feel that this whole bridging this bit distance, disconnection between theory and practice is just so important today, right? And today there is so much of disconnection between these two. There are people who are only doing intellectual work and they really don't have experience or what's happening on ground with ordinary people lives, right? On the other hand, we have people who are actually working with people, but they really don't have any time to do any intellectual work at all. So we feel that it's important to bring this two things together. Then only you could actually come up with some much more grounded interventions, which is relevant. So that's what we've been trying to do. And so this is what I just wanted to share as a part of the presentation. And if somebody's have any questions, I'm happy to respond. Yeah, thank you.
Thank you very much, Sumanas ji, for that talk. We have a couple of questions from our viewers. One of them is, how do we as a thriving capitalist economy assure a balance between the have and have-nots?
Uh, it's basically whatever the ideas that have discussed. We should see it as a normative idea, right? Normative idea is something, it deals with the question of what should be, right? So you should know the destination before you start something, right? Similarly, whatever I have discussed is like a normative idea, and this normativity is embedded in all forms of or development ideas, even including the capitalism, right? So capitalism says that at some point everybody they can take flights, they could travel on that. But how many people are actually doing it? Very few people, a very small section of the society. But we are always been trying to working towards that. So similarly, I would say that this whole idea of Swaraj, which is based on decentralization of politics, based on consensus, and bringing self-sufficiency in economics, we could actually bring reduce the distance between haves and have-nots. And but it's a very long-term project, right? You can't just do it in overnight, right? This is like a destination. If you agree for all these kinds of basic principles, then you should start keep on working towards that direction, right? So that is something very, very important. So this is what I just wanted to respond for that question. Yeah.
Another question that has been asked is, could you just delineate or elaborate a little more on the radical economic thoughts of J.C. Kumarappa and also his book Economy of Permanence, I believe?
Right. So yeah, so whatever the idea of self-sufficiency that I talked about is actually based on Kumarappa's writings, right? So whatever I have discussed is actually based on the writings of Gandhi and Kumarappa, and this is exactly what they were trying to do, right? So building an economic system which is based on the idea of self-sufficiency, right? And also that has the other political dimension of bringing building a decentralized political system on top of this kind of an economic system, right? And that's exactly what I've discussed. And the economy of permanence is very important book, and I think everybody should read it. And also I would recommend very recent a book called it's called as it's a Kumarappa's biography. It's called as what is that? It's published by Oxford University Press. Uh, it's called as Web of Freedom, right? So it's a very recent book. I would even recommend people to read that to understand this larger ideas. And also, actually, they could actually refer my own book, which recently came out. It's titled as Development as Swaraj Towards a Sustainable and Equitable Future. So it was published by Routledge, and it's available on Amazon. It just came out last year. So I would say it's also another book where actually they could go through it to understand Kumarappa's economic thought in much more detail. Yeah.
Another question that has been asked is politics, you mentioned, could be developed under Swaraj as that which has consensus and decentralization. But
Yeah.
aren't these the basic pillars of democracy and hence already existing in our politics?
That is the difference, right? So I don't see that, for example, key feature if you see for example, Indian democratic system, even though we call it as a democracy, that's what I was saying, right? So as citizens, we really don't have much stake in lot of decisions that are being made, right? A lot of things are today, for example, in a small town in like Melkote in Karnataka, a lot of the decisions are actually made in cities like Bangalore and Delhi, right? Even though we call it as a panchayat raj system, even it doesn't have any financial autonomy, right? A lot of things often through gram sabhas, we can give a plan of it, we can chalk out it, but everything is finally decided on the top layers, right? That's a major difference. And all the decisions that you see is actually based on majoritarian rule. There is no consensus at all, especially these days, right? Where is the consensus? Everything is taken based on majoritarian rule. We really don't listen to the minorities, right? That's a big problem. So that's why the political system that is being advocated through idea of Swaraj is something quite radical than whatever the system that we have today, right? It actually, even though it says in words, it should be take consensus and all that, but in reality it's not decentralized as much as needed, as well as decisions are not being made often based on consensus. Yeah.
Another question that was asked is regarding your idea of energy, like how petrol is within or crude oil is a powerful thing to wield, and it is in the hands of a few. But now that India is, looking into hydrogen, it's looking into ethanol, which will be through the sugarcane that we have in Uttar Pradesh and as well in the Deccan areas, and then we have lithium that is coming from Jammu and Kashmir. Don't you think this is a positive direction towards the decentralization that you're talking about?
No, one is when I'm saying human energy should be the primary. That doesn't mean that we don't need any other kinds of energy forms, right? So we should not see it in a very absolute terms. So that we should be very the whole world works in relative terms, right? So, but what I'm saying is you should see, but we don't in all our energy debate we don't consider physical labor as an energy issue at all, right? Even though the major employment giving a sector like agriculture, even though it's largely dependent on physical labor, we don't recognize that. We don't consider that as a part of the energy debate. That's what I was trying to say, right? And even though all these kinds of different forms that we're talking about is again, it's not in the hands of ordinary people. I really don't have control over the gasoline, or I don't have control over lithium, right? So that's what I'm saying. So we should since if you really are interested in creating a much more democratic society, so resources should be accessible to everybody, right? So one such important source is human energy. That's what I'm saying. But that doesn't mean that we don't need any other forms of, definitely we need, wherever required, definitely we should explore that. But our primary energy source that drives our economic systems should be the physical labor. That's what I'm trying to say. Yeah. And also at the
And
end of the day, unless we simplify our life, unless whatever kind of energy source you bring onto to the table, unless you simplify our material way of living, so it cannot solve the problem of resources and environment in the longer run, right? So that we should be very, very clear of. And so yeah, so that's why here in the idea of Swaraj, the idea of development. So once you fulfill your basic material needs like food, clothing, and shelter, it shifts to more towards spiritual or moral dimension, right? So achieving this sort of mental state, achieving peace is the ultimate goal. But that is completely contrary to the modern sustainable development, for example, right? It only talks about economic growth. Economic growth is nothing but accumulating more and more material wealth and power, right? But at the same time, it says that we should establish a world of equality and sustainability. But there is a contradiction in it, right? So if your conception of good life is accumulation of more and more material wealth and power, it won't lead to a much more equitable and sustainable future, right? If you're emphasizing on that, you have to lead a much more simpler life. So that is the connection that we have, and we should be very clear of that. Yeah.
so you talked about bridging the gap between intellectual labor and manual labor, but
Yeah.
one question that has been asked is that through Jeevana Shaale, which is
Yeah.
the
Yeah.
10 students that you take
Yeah.
who have
Yeah.
walked out from the
Yeah. Yeah.
original the
Yeah.
mainstream
Yes.
education, the syllabus lacks math and science big time. So, like, how are you going to bridge the gap between intellectual and manual when there is such less exposure to math and science?
So that's exactly what I'm saying, right? So even though what do you mean by science? Always we think that science means only everything should be done in a lab. No, that's what I'm saying, right? Doing, for example, spinning or doing a weaving, it also has a science in it. There is a maths in it, right? Farming has a maths in it. So through these activities, you could actually teach mathematics. You could actually teach physics. For example, Gandhi always used to say this, giving beautiful example of charaka. Right? He was saying that charaka, if you just taken as an example, while actually teaching charaka, one is you're teaching them livelihood. At the same time, you can teach others so many things. Right? Just keeping charaka, you could teach history, right? Through textile history, you could actually teach history, what happened from last 300 years after industrial revolution, right? And also just focusing on the wood that you use to make charka, you could actually teach botany, what kind of material you can actually require. And also, the speed that actually the wheel that turns, you could actually teach physics. So like this, it's everything is just so interconnected. The problem is we are compartmentalizing everything. That's a big problem. The whole deviation of science, arts, commerce, that's itself in modern education system, that itself is problematic, right? It's just so interconnected, and we're all teaching all those things,
Mhm.
right? Through these various activities, we're all teaching all those things. Yeah, that's what I'm saying. Yeah.
So, like, if my question is, in through Jeevana Shaale,
Yeah.
can a child only be good in textiles, or they can aim for other things as well? Like Gandhi was a lawyer, for example. So,
Right.
with my educational exposure through Jeevana Shaale, how
Right.
exactly does it help me to prepare eventually? Of course, Jeevana Shaale won't help me to prepare for law, but how does it
Absolutely.
help me get the basic education to then find the resources to prepare for whatever I'd
Right.
like to do?
So one thing that we are very clear is, it's nothing to do with the formal schooling and the so-called occupations that are dependent on formal schooling, right? We are not at all encouraging it. And we have made it very clear. This is for the ones who are not interested in all those stuff, right? So that's why, so that is one thing. And the second is, even though after some point you would like to take 10th standard exam or 12th standard exam, you could do it. Once you know the basic language, basic mathematics, it's not a big deal to pass your 10th, right? You could do that. But we are not hand holding on or pushing you to do it, right? Because that we are very, very clear. So our interest is, whoever interested in staying back in a village and leading a life which is centered around human labor, and who could understand the importance of it in the larger context of environment and inequality, so those are the ones who are taken to this program. Yeah.
I think that brings us to the end. We're done with all the questions. Thank you very much, Sumanas ji, to give us time on a Sunday. to have this very important talk about Swaraj and how the Gandhian idea is still relevant in the economic development that India must then integrate into the mainstream. Thank you very much. Namaste.
Thank you. Namaste.